The next morning, after that tense silence in the kitchen, the house didn't feel different on the surface, but financially it had always been a structured environment that most people misunderstood. The mortgage statements still arrived in the same beige envelopes. The insurance premiums still auto-drafted from the same account, and the grocery receipts still stacked quietly in the drawer by the refrigerator like nothing in the household ever carried hidden weight. But underneath those ordinary details was a system of ownership and responsibility that no one in the family ever bothered to fully read. The kitchen table had become the unofficial center of financial reality in the house. That was where bills were opened first: mortgage, utilities, property tax notices, car insurance renewals, and credit card statements that reflected shared living expenses but not shared ownership. My mother-in-law often sat there assuming contribution meant control, as if paying for groceries or occasionally covering a utility bill gave her influence over the structure of the home itself. But contribution and ownership were never the same thing, and I understood that distinction more clearly than anyone wanted to admit. I wasn't raised in wealth, but I was raised around documentation. That meant I didn't confuse emotional language with financial structure. When people said, "We helped pay for this house," I looked at payment trails. When they said, "We should have a say," I looked at whose name appeared on the title, whose account the mortgage pulled from, and whose liability remained if everything collapsed. That was the difference between feeling involved and being legally responsible. The truth was, I looked like the least powerful person in the room. A young white American woman in simple clothes, usually standing quietly while others spoke louder, often mistaken for someone passive or financially dependent. But silence is often misread in financial environments. I wasn't silent because I lacked understanding. I was silent because I didn't need to perform understanding that I already had documented. Every bill in that house told a story. The mortgage showed obligation. The property tax records showed legal ownership. The utility bills showed usage, not authority. Even the credit card statements, which my mother-in-law sometimes referenced as proof of family contribution, only showed spending patterns, not rights. None of them equal control. And then there was him, the white American billionaire who never inserted himself into arguments, but always noticed when people confused cash flow with ownership. He didn't sit at the table like a family member trying to resolve conflict. He stood slightly apart, like someone reviewing a system that had already been correctly designed. Mid to late 60s, calm expression, suit understated enough that most people underestimated how structured his thinking was. He once told me something I didn't forget. Most financial conflict isn't about money. It's about misunderstanding what money represents. At the time, I thought it sounded abstract. Now I realized it was literal. Money in this house wasn't just currency. It was a trail of responsibility. And responsibility always had a name attached to it. What my mother-in-law saw as shared family life, I saw as layered financial obligations with very specific ownership boundaries. That's why I never reacted when assumptions were made. Because assumptions don't hold up under documentation. And in this house, documentation existed everywhere, just not always where people bothered to look. There was one item, though, that no one had properly examined yet. One folder that stayed closed unless necessary. One document that connected every payment, every obligation, and every assumption back to a single legal structure that most people in the house had never questioned. And once that folder was opened again, the entire narrative they had built about family helps family would stop sounding like tradition and start collapsing under the weight of recorded ownership. In that house, the biggest mistake wasn't financial. It was perceptual, because everyone who walked through those rooms believed they understood money when in reality they were only reacting to appearances. They saw a quiet young white American woman and assumed silence meant weakness. They saw a modest lifestyle and assumed lack of wealth. They saw a family home and assumed shared ownership. And every one of those assumptions was wrong in a way that only documentation could eventually correct. The truth about financial systems is simple, but most people refuse to see it. Looking rich and owning assets are not the same thing. Looking rich is about perception, cars in the driveway, conversations at the table, contributions to groceries, or occasional payments toward bills. Owning assets is about structure, whose name is on the deed, whose account carries the mortgage, whose liability remains if payments stop, and whose signature determines what happens next. In this house, that distinction created an invisible divide. My mother-in-law often spoke in emotional financial language, where contribution became ownership and presence became entitlement. She believed that because money had flowed into the household in different ways, control should be shared like a family resource. But financial reality does not distribute authority based on emotion. It distributes authority based on recorded responsibility. That's where the confusion deepened. Monthly payments were constantly misinterpreted as ownership proof. If someone paid for groceries, they felt entitled to decisions about the home. If someone contributed to utilities, they believed that influence extended to property decisions. But monthly payments are not ownership. They are consumption costs. They keep systems running, but they do not define who owns the system. And yet, emotional language kept overriding structural truth. Loud accusations about fairness filled the room more often than quiet verification of documents. We helped, we contributed, we deserve, all phrases that carried emotional weight but no legal standing. Meanwhile, the quiet documents, the ones sitting in folders, bank records, and title paperwork, never raised their voice, but they always determined the outcome. I used to watch these conversations unfold and notice something important. The people who understood least about financial structure spoke the most confidently about ownership. The people who understood it rarely spoke at all. Because once you understand that money follows documentation, not emotion, you stop trying to win arguments and start reviewing records. That's the part most people miss. Control does not come from being heard. It comes from being recorded. And being recorded means your name appears in places that matter legally. Property deeds, mortgage agreements, insurance policies, tax records, and liability structures. Everything else is just interpretation. So I started asking myself a question that quietly changed how I saw every interaction in that house. If everything were removed except legal documents, who would still own what? Who would still be responsible? And who would simply be emotionally attached to something they never actually controlled? The answer to that question was never comfortable for the people who relied on assumption instead of structure. And that is why the gray folder mattered more than any conversation in that house. Because inside it was something that did not care about opinions, family expectations, or emotional pressure. It contained the one thing that always outlives argument: legal structure. But what no one else had realized yet was that the most important page in that folder had not been opened in front of them. Not yet. And when it finally was, it wouldn't just challenge their beliefs about money. It would completely rewrite who they thought had the right to speak about the house at all. To understand what was happening inside that house, you don't need a finance degree. You need a simple understanding of how money actually behaves when it is tied to people, property, and responsibility. Because once you strip away emotion, money is not complicated. It either builds structure or drains it. It either protects ownership or slowly erodes it. A lot of people in that house kept treating money like emotion. They thought because they were involved in daily expenses, groceries, utilities, occasional bills, they were part of ownership. But in financial reality, there is a clear difference between what supports a system and what owns the system. Assets are the things that protect you or bring money into your control. In a house context, the asset is not just the building itself, it is the legal structure behind it. The deed, the title, the recorded ownership, the name that remains when everything is reviewed by a bank or a court. Assets don't care who feels attached to them. They only respond to structure. Liabilities, on the other hand, are the quiet drains. They are the mortgage payments, the insurance costs, the maintenance bills, the taxes. They are not evil, but they are constant. They remove money from accounts over time, regardless of emotion or intention. Most people confuse paying for liabilities with owning assets, which is exactly where financial misunderstanding begins. And then there is cash flow, the invisible part most people never see clearly. Cash flow is like an employee you can't physically see, but who is always working in the background. Every payment made, every bill processed, every automated withdrawal is part of a system deciding who is carrying responsibility and who is simply participating in it. In that house, cash flow was tracked through mortgage records, utility payments, insurance drafts, and credit card statements. None of those documents were emotional. They were mechanical. They showed direction, not intention. Money was either flowing toward responsibility or away from it, but it was always recorded. That's where documents become the real boundary. Because paper doesn't argue. A deed doesn't negotiate. A bank statement doesn't interpret feelings. A title doesn't adjust itself based on family expectations. These documents form a protective layer around assets, and that layer is what actually defines control. Even things like payment records, tax filings, and insurance policies were acting as quiet barriers in the background of this situation. They determined who was legally responsible, who was financially exposed, and who had no authority despite emotional involvement. And when disputes arise, those documents always speak louder than any conversation ever could. This is also why evidence always wins over emotion. Because evidence does not respond to tone, pressure, or guilt. It simply exists. Once a bank record, deed, or signed agreement is placed on the table, emotional arguments lose their weight immediately, not because feelings don't matter, but because they are not legally binding. That was the reality slowly building beneath the surface of the house. While people argued about fairness and contribution, the actual financial structure had already been written down in a way that could not be changed by conversation. And somewhere inside that gray folder, there was one specific document that had not yet been fully revealed to everyone involved. A document that didn't just explain who paid what, but who actually owned everything. And once it was placed in full view, there would be no more confusion about family, contribution, or entitlement. Only structure would remain. The moment the gray folder was placed back on the kitchen table, the atmosphere in the house shifted in a way that was almost invisible but financially irreversible, because this time, it was no longer just a symbol of tension. It was becoming a system of proof. The folder was slightly open now, and inside it, the property deed was partially visible, its formal layout and stamped structure reminding everyone in the room that ownership is not something spoken, it is something recorded. Next to it lay a printed bank statement, and on one line there was a red circle drawn around a specific transaction trail. Mortgage payments routed consistently from a single account, tied to a single legal name, reinforcing the financial structure behind the house. No one spoke at first, because documents have a way of interrupting arguments without saying a word. The young white American woman stood calmly beside the table, her posture unchanged from earlier scenes. There was no attempt to prove anything emotionally. Instead, there was a quiet readiness, the kind that comes from understanding systems rather than reacting to them. Her expression wasn't defensive, it was settled, as if she had already read every possible version of this conversation long before it happened. Her best friend, still present in the emotional space of the conflict, looked at the documents differently. To her, they were just papers mixed into a personal situation. But to the woman holding the reality of ownership, they were structure. And structure always outlasts interpretation. On the edge of the table, a phone screen was lit up, showing a short video clip, security footage timestamps and access logs that quietly documented movement through the house at specific hours. It wasn't dramatic footage, but it didn't need to be. It simply recorded reality without bias. Nearby, placed almost unintentionally but visually powerful, was a legal folder from a law office, what appeared to be custody or responsibility documentation tied to financial or household structure, reinforcing that this situation had already moved beyond emotional disagreement and into formal legal territory. A sealed envelope labeled prenup-style agreement rested beside it, unopened but present, suggesting that multiple layers of legal structure had already been built long before this confrontation ever began. And then there were smaller details that spoke even louder than words. A company badge placed in a wallet on the counter, implying structured financial identity beyond this household. And a set of new house keys resting on the table, untouched, as if waiting to confirm who actually had authorized access going forward. The billionaire stood slightly back from the scene, observing without interfering. He didn't need to explain anything. He simply noticed the shift. Because people who understand systems recognize the moment when emotion stops being relevant and structure takes over. His expression suggested quiet confirmation. She had prepared for this long before anyone else realized there was something to prepare for. Yet, even with all of this visible, not everyone in the room understood what was happening. The opposing side still believed influence came from emotional pressure, not documentation. They still spoke in terms of fairness, family, and expectations, unaware that none of those concepts override legal structure once it is properly established. That is the lesson repeating itself silently through every document on that table. People who understand money do not win by speaking louder. They win by building systems that do not require speech at all. Because when ownership is properly documented, arguments stop being debates and become interpretations of facts that already exist. But just as the weight of those documents began to settle into the room, there was still one missing moment, one final layer of pressure that had not yet fully arrived. And it would not come from the table or the house or even the documents themselves. It would come from outside the system entirely, from family expectation, social pressure, and legal confrontation that had not yet fully revealed its final shape. As the documents sat openly on the kitchen table, something else began to happen that no bank statement or deed could prevent. Pressure. Not financial pressure this time, but social pressure, quiet, emotional, and deeply familiar to anyone who has ever been told that belonging must be earned through compliance. My mother-in-law was the first to speak again, her voice shifting away from confusion and into accusation. The tone changed from questioning ownership to questioning character. Because when people cannot challenge documentation, they often try to challenge the person holding it. She called it selfish to bring legal papers into a family conversation. She implied that real family doesn't hide behind documents. And slowly, the language shifted towards something more emotional, more familiar, and more dangerous: guilt. Other family voices began to echo that same pressure. The idea was no longer about the house itself. It was about morality, about whether it was right to assert ownership in a situation where other people felt entitled to access. Someone even suggested that family helps family, as if that phrase could override a property deed, a bank record, or a legal structure already established long before emotions entered the room. And that is where financial manipulation often hides, not in contracts, but in language. Because words like family, loyalty, and support can quietly shift from emotional values into financial expectations. Suddenly, ownership becomes framed as selfishness, boundaries become framed as betrayal, and documentation becomes framed as aggression. But the young white American woman remained still, not cold, not detached, just anchored, because she understood something that most people in that room did not. Emotional pressure is often used to override financial clarity. If you cannot convince someone through law, you try to convince them through guilt. If you cannot access assets through rights, you attempt to access them through relationships. She had seen this pattern before in smaller forms. The expectation to contribute more because it's family. The assumption that shared space means shared control. The subtle pressure to keep paying, keep accommodating, keep absorbing costs in order to maintain peace. And she had also seen where that leads. People overpaying for acceptance, staying in financial arrangements they don't legally benefit from, or holding on to assets under emotional obligation instead of rational ownership. That is one of the most overlooked financial traps in everyday life: paying for belonging. People will continue covering bills they are not responsible for just to avoid being labeled difficult. They will keep houses they cannot afford just to preserve appearances. They will accept financial imbalance just to avoid emotional conflict. And over time, that pressure can reshape entire financial lives, not because of numbers, but because of perception. The billionaire remained silent through all of it, but his presence changed how the pressure felt. He didn't intervene because intervention wasn't necessary. He understood that this stage of the conflict was not about information anymore. It was about psychology. People were no longer arguing about the house. They were arguing about identity, fairness, and emotional entitlement. At one point, a comment surfaced suggesting that bringing lawyers, documents, and structured ownership into a family matter made everything feel transactional and cold. But from a financial perspective, that statement missed the core truth. Systems are not cold, they are stable. Emotion may create connection, but only structure creates protection. And so the room became divided in a way that had nothing to do with relationships anymore. On one side was emotional reasoning, expectations, loyalty, and shared history. On the other side was recorded reality, deeds, payments, titles, and access logs that did not respond to sentiment. The young woman did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply allowed the documents to remain visible because she understood something fundamental. When systems are correctly built, they do not require defense. They only require recognition. But what no one in the room fully realized yet was that recognition was not the final stage. Because once pressure fails, the next step is escalation through formal channels, lawyers, official verification, and structured enforcement. And that is where the situation was heading next, whether the family was ready for it or not. And in that shift, one question quietly emerged beneath everything else. Why do people who understand money choose structure over approval, even when it costs them relationships? The answer was about to reveal itself not through conversation, but through consequences. The moment the gray folder was finally opened fully, the entire atmosphere in the house stopped feeling like a family disagreement and started feeling like a financial audit. No one raised their voice first. No one needed to. Because what was inside that folder didn't respond to emotion. It responded only to structure, signatures, and recorded truth. The property deed was placed flat on the table. Clean, official, unmistakable. The kind of document that does not ask for interpretation. It simply declares ownership. And in that moment, every assumption in the room had to either align with it or collapse. My mother-in-law leaned forward first, trying to speak, trying to reframe what she was seeing as unfair or misunderstood. But her words slowed as more pages were revealed beneath the deed. Bank records, payment histories, closing documents, each page reinforcing a single financial reality that had existed long before the conversation ever began. The mortgage payment trail showed consistent withdrawals tied to one primary account. The utility records confirmed responsibility, not shared sentiment. The insurance documentation listed the insured party clearly. And the title structure, once fully visible, left no ambiguity about who had legal authority over the property and who did not. The most uncomfortable part was not the presence of documents. It was the absence of contradiction. Nothing in the folder supported the emotional version of ownership that had been assumed. There was no shared title, no joint authority, no ambiguous structure that could be interpreted through family expectation. There was only recorded fact. The young white American woman remained composed as each page was reviewed. Not because the situation was easy, but because it was already understood. She didn't need to react to the reveal. She had built her position around it long before anyone else realized there was something to challenge. The best friend, who had been at the center of emotional tension earlier, now looked at the documents differently. What had once been dismissed as just paperwork now carried irreversible meaning. The gap between presence and ownership had never been clearer. Even the white American billionaire, standing slightly apart in his quiet, understated suit, didn't intervene with emotion or commentary at first. He simply observed the final alignment between structure and reality. Then he spoke, not to escalate, but to clarify what everyone in the room was now forced to understand. You don't negotiate ownership. You verify it. That sentence landed without force, but with finality. Because it wasn't an opinion, it was a principle. And principles don't argue back. The room went quiet again, but this time it was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of correction. The kind that happens when a belief system finally meets documentation it cannot override. Every claim that had been based on contribution, family involvement, or emotional investment had now been filtered through legal structure, and only one version remained intact. The others simply could not survive contact with the records. And yet, even in that moment, something more important was unfolding. Because once ownership is legally confirmed, the next phase is not discussion, it is execution. Rights follow structure, and structure follows documentation, which meant what came next was no longer about who felt wronged or who felt entitled. It was about what legally happens when a property is sold, when a title is enforced, and when financial systems move forward regardless of emotional resistance. The documents on the table had already answered the first question, but the second question, the consequence of that answer, was still ahead, and it would not remain theoretical for long. After the documents were verified, the situation in the house stopped being emotional entirely and moved into a phase that no one could argue with anymore. Enforcement through legal and financial systems. It didn't happen loudly. It didn't need to. It happened the way it always does when ownership is already clearly recorded, quietly, methodically, and in full alignment with paper, banks, and law. The first confirmation came from a lawyer's review. Every page in the folder was checked against official records, the deed, the title registration, the mortgage history, and the payment logs. Nothing was speculative. Everything matched external systems, county records, bank statements, and signed agreements. The conclusion was simple and unavoidable. The legal owner of the property had been correctly identified all along, and the structure supporting that ownership was valid and enforceable. Once that confirmation was issued, the next steps followed standard procedure. Access rights were updated to reflect legal ownership. That meant physical control of the property was no longer a matter of family expectation or informal usage. It was tied directly to title authority. Locks were changed in accordance with ownership rights, not as an act of emotion, but as a routine administrative step in protecting an asset. At the same time, the bank systems aligned with the verified structure. Mortgage records, withdrawal histories, and account responsibilities were cross-checked against the official documentation. There were no inconsistencies. The financial trail was clean, structured, and legally binding. The bank did not interpret feelings. It only confirmed ownership and obligation, and both were now clearly defined. If there had been any expectation that emotional claims could override documentation, that expectation disappeared at this stage. Because once a system is aligned across legal, financial, and property records, there is nothing left for opinion to influence. Courts do not prioritize narratives over titles. Banks do not prioritize relationships over account ownership. And legal systems do not prioritize family expectations over signed agreements. The people who had relied on informal assumptions about contribution and access gradually realized something uncomfortable. Participation is not ownership, and emotional investment is not legal authority. The difference between those two concepts had now been fully enforced. In practical terms, the consequences were straightforward. The property remained protected under its rightful ownership structure. Any attempts to assert control without legal standing were no longer valid. Access was no longer assumed, it was defined. Responsibility was no longer shared emotionally, it was assigned legally. And any prior misunderstanding about control over the asset no longer carried weight in any formal system. But the most important shift was not what changed externally, it was what became clear internally. Because when systems like this resolve, they leave behind a pattern that is easy to recognize if you know what to look for. Keep your documents organized and accessible. Understand exactly whose name is on the title before assuming ownership. Track where the money actually flows, not where people say it flows. Protect your accounts from emotional decision-making. Never trade financial responsibility for social approval. And most importantly, never allow feelings to replace verified records. These are not aggressive rules. They are protective ones. Because in every financial structure, whether it is a home, a business, or a shared family arrangement, the truth is always the same. Documents decide outcomes, not emotions. As the house settled into its new legal reality, one final question remained unspoken but unavoidable. Not about ownership anymore, but about identity. Because once a person learns how systems actually work, once they see how money, law, and documentation determine control, they rarely go back to seeing the world the same way again. And that is where the real shift begins, not in what was taken or kept, but in who understands the system from that moment forward. By the time everything had settled, there was nothing left in the house that could be described as confusion. What remained was clarity, clean, structured, and slightly uncomfortable for anyone who had relied on emotion instead of documentation. Because once legal systems confirm ownership, there is no longer a debate. There is only recognition. The white American billionaire, still calm in his understated suit, looked at the table one final time. He had never raised his voice, never tried to control the situation, and never needed to. His role had been observation and understanding. Because people who truly understand money rarely try to perform authority. They simply recognize where authority already exists. And then there was the young white American woman. She stood differently now compared to the beginning of this story, not because her surroundings had changed, but because her understanding had. She no longer looked like someone being evaluated by the situation. She looked like someone who understood the system underneath it. That is the quiet shift most people never see. When a person stops reacting to financial pressure emotionally and starts responding to it structurally. Because once you understand that money follows documentation, not approval, you stop trying to be convincing and start being precise. The lesson embedded in everything that had happened was not about a house, a family disagreement, or even a legal correction. It was about identity. The identity of people who understand financial systems versus those who only experience them emotionally. People who understand money do not need to speak loudly about it. They do not need to prove ownership through arguments. They do not rely on perception to validate reality. Instead, they operate through 5 quiet pillars: ownership structure, cash flow awareness, documentation discipline, emotional control, and patience under pressure. Ownership structure determines what is legally yours. Cash flow reveals what you actually control over time. Documentation proves what cannot be disputed. Discipline ensures decisions are not driven by emotional pressure, and patience allows truth to surface without forcing it. In contrast, emotional financial thinking relies on noise, on perception, on contribution stories, on social validation, and on assumptions that involvement equals ownership. But as this situation showed, those assumptions collapse the moment verified records enter the conversation. The billionaire never needed to explain any of that in detail. His presence alone represented a principle. Real financial understanding is quiet. It does not escalate. It clarifies. It does not compete for attention. It waits for structure to speak. The young woman, on the other hand, represented the second half of that truth. She had learned, not through theory, but through experience, that financial safety is not built on trust alone, but on clarity. Not on emotion alone, but on structure. And most importantly, not on what people say, but on what documents confirm. And that is why her reaction at the end was not victory, and not resentment either. It was something far more stable: understanding. The understanding that no one can use emotional pressure to override properly established ownership unless you allow them to. Because in the end, financial systems do not reward the loudest voice. They reward the clearest structure. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to win arguments about money. You start building systems that do not require arguments at all. So the final lesson is simple, but it changes everything. Don't try to look powerful in financial situations. Build a life where reality, ownership, and documentation protect you quietly in the background without needing permission, explanation, or approval from anyone else. My mother-in-law said family helps family.